There is a country where the first human beings outside Africa took their first steps 1.85 million years ago. A country whose mountains are taller than the Alps, but nobody talks about them. A country that invented wine 8,000 years ago, while the rest of the world was still using tools made from stone and bone. A country where a 6,000-room city was carved entirely inside a mountain. A country whose music is literally traveling through interstellar space right now, chosen by NASA to represent all of humanity. And a country that is simultaneously recognized by the United Nations as one thing and by the map on the ground as something else entirely. That country is Georgia, and once you understand what's actually happening here, you'll realize the world has been looking at the wrong map. Most Georgia videos show you Tbilisi's architecture, the wine, the mountains. We're not doing that. We're going to 1.85 million years ago, when the first humans outside Africa were eating raw mammoth meat on Georgian soil. We're going to the deepest cave on Earth, which is in Georgia. We're going to the ruins of a cave city bigger than anything the Romans built. And we're going to the most controversial border dispute in Europe right now, a war that happened in 2008 that most people in the West have almost completely forgotten about. By Fact 7, you'll understand why Georgia doesn't make sense on any map you've ever seen. Fact 1. The first humans outside Africa lived in Georgia, and they were caring for each other 1.85 million years ago. Here's the fact that rewrote human history and barely made the news. In a small Georgian town called Tbilisi, about 90 kilometers southwest of Tbilisi, archaeologists found 5 human skulls buried beneath a medieval village. These skulls are 1.85 million years old, the oldest human remains ever discovered outside of Africa. But here's what nobody talks about. Among those 5 skulls was one belonging to an individual who had lost every single tooth years before their death. The jawbone had completely healed over. This person had no teeth. In a world without cooking, without fire, without any way to process food, a toothless human cannot survive alone. They cannot chew raw meat. They cannot strip vegetation. They cannot crack bones. And yet this individual survived for years after losing their teeth, which means the people around them fed them, supported them, kept them alive when they had nothing left to offer. 1.85 million years ago, in Georgia, the first evidence of human compassion outside Africa was found underneath a medieval village that tourists walk past on their way to a wine tasting. Fact 2. Georgia invented wine, and France has been taking credit for 200 years. Here's the most controversial thing I'm going to say in this entire video. France did not invent wine. Georgia did, 8,000 years before France had a wine industry. In 2017, archaeologists found wine residue inside clay jars buried in southern Georgia, dating back to 6000 BC. To put that in context, prehistoric humans at that time were still using tools made from stone and bone. They hadn't invented the wheel. They hadn't built any cities. And yet in Georgia, they were making wine on a large scale, storing it in giant clay vessels called couveuvres, buried underground to control the temperature. France's wine culture is roughly 2,500 years old. Georgia's is 8,000 years old. Georgia has been making wine for longer than France has existed as a civilization. And here's the part that makes this even more remarkable. Georgia has over 500 grape varieties. France has around 250. Italy has around 350. Georgia has almost double France's variety count and has been cultivating those grapes for 3 times as long. UNESCO recognized Georgia's ancient winemaking method as intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The world's wine culture didn't start in Bordeaux or Burgundy. It started in a country most wine drinkers couldn't find on a map. Fact 3. The deepest cave on Earth is in Georgia, and almost nobody knows it. Ask anyone to name the deepest cave on Earth, and they'll guess somewhere in America, maybe in New Mexico or Kentucky. Wrong. Veryovkina Cave in the Gagra mountain range in western Georgia reaches a depth of 2,212 meters. That's 7,257 feet straight down. The deepest cave ever explored by humans, anywhere on the planet. To understand what 2,212 meters means, if you stacked 5 Eiffel Towers on top of each other and dropped them into this cave vertically, they would disappear completely with room to spare at the bottom. The cave was only fully explored in 2018, when a team of cavers reached the bottom after a weeks-long expedition that required underground camps, specialized equipment, and ropes longer than anything previously used in cave exploration. The deepest place humans have ever descended on dry land is in a country most people think of as a small nation between Russia and Turkey. Georgia doesn't just have history underground, it has the deepest underground on Earth. Fact 4. Europe's highest mountains are not the Alps, they're in Georgia, and the tourism industry has been lying to you. Here's the controversial take that nobody in the Swiss tourism board wants you to hear. Mont Blanc, France's famous alpine peak, is not the highest mountain in Europe, not even close. Mont Blanc stands at 4,808 meters. It is regularly described as the roof of Western Europe and the highest peak in Europe. But Georgia's Saqqara stands at 5,193 meters, 385 meters taller than Mont Blanc. Georgia has 14 peaks above 4,000 meters. Russia's Elbrus, technically in the Caucasus, reaches 5,642 meters, the highest point in Europe by any definition. The Caucasus Mountains that form Georgia's northern border are not just taller than the Alps, they are in a completely different category. And yet, when people plan a European mountaineering trip, they go to Switzerland. When documentaries show Europe's dramatic mountains, they show the Alps. The Caucasus, which includes Georgia, gets almost no attention despite being geologically more dramatic, significantly higher, and far less crowded. Georgia's mountains are Europe's best-kept secret, and the alpine tourism industry has every financial reason to keep it that way. Fact 5. Georgia built a 6,000-room city inside a mountain to hide from the Mongols. In the 12th century, Georgia's Queen Tamar ordered the construction of something that should not have been possible: a city inside a mountain. Vardzia is a fortress monastery palace complex carved directly into the rock face of Erusheti Mountain in southern Georgia. 13 levels, 6,000 rooms, a bakery, a church, wine cellars, a self-sustaining irrigation system that channeled mountain water through tunnels carved into solid rock, royal apartments, all of it inside a mountain. The complex was built as a refuge against the Mongol Empire, the most powerful military force in human history at that time. The idea was simple and extraordinary. If your enemies can't see your city, they can't destroy it. And it worked, for a while. In 1283, an earthquake destroyed more than 2/3 of the complex, exposing the hidden rooms to the outside. The Mongols found what remained, but enough of Vardzia survived that today visitors can walk through the caves, climb the carved staircases, and stand in the ancient wine cellars of a 12th century underground city that was built to outsmart the greatest conquering army the world has ever seen. Fact 6. NASA chose Georgian music to represent all of humanity and sent it into interstellar space. In 1977, NASA launched the Voyager spacecraft with a golden record containing music from Earth, sounds chosen to represent the entire human species to any intelligent life that might find the probe somewhere in the universe. They chose Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Chuck Berry, Louis Armstrong, music from dozens of cultures worldwide. And they chose a Georgian polyphonic folk song called Chakrulo. Not French music, not British music, not American music beyond Chuck Berry. Georgian music. The scientists and curators at NASA, led by Carl Sagan, listened to music from every culture on Earth and decided that Georgian polyphonic singing was among the most worthy to represent humanity to the cosmos. Voyager 1 is now the furthest human-made object from Earth in history, over 23 billion kilometers away and still traveling. Georgia's music is literally in interstellar space right now, moving further from Earth every second of every day. The only country in Europe whose cultural heritage has left the solar system. Fact 7. Georgia has 2 countries inside it that most of the world refuses to recognize. Here's where Georgia stops making sense on any map you've ever seen. Georgia officially controls 69,700 square kilometers. That's the number on every map. That's what the United Nations recognizes. That's the internationally accepted answer. But on the ground, the reality is completely different. 2 regions of Georgia, Abkhazia in the northwest and South Ossetia in the north, have been outside Georgian government control since the early 1990s. Both declared independence. Both received military support from Russia. Both now have Russian military bases on their territory. And after the 2008 war, a 5-day conflict that received a week of Western media coverage before being largely forgotten, Russia formally recognized both regions as independent states. The rest of the world disagreed. Only 5 UN member states recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The vast majority consider them Georgian territory under Russian military occupation. So here is the situation as it actually exists. On the map, Georgia is one country. On the ground, Georgia controls roughly 72% of its own internationally recognized territory. The other 28% is administered by 2 breakaway governments backed by Russian military force. And as of January 2026, Georgia's own parliament voted to abolish its government in exile for South Ossetia, a decision so significant that even Georgia's own politicians called it a historic turning point. Georgia's borders on every map you've ever seen are not what exists on the ground. And that gap between the map and reality is one of Europe's most frozen, most ignored, and most dangerous geopolitical disputes. Fact 8. The Golden Fleece was real, and it was in Georgia. One of the most famous stories in Greek mythology is the legend of Jason and the Argonauts, heroes who sailed across the known world in search of the Golden Fleece, a magical object of enormous power kept in a land called Caucasus. Modern historians have confirmed that Caucasus was Georgia, not a mythological place, not a poetic invention, an actual historical region on the eastern coast of the Black Sea in what is now western Georgia. And the Golden Fleece itself, historians believe, was not a supernatural object at all. It was a technique. Ancient peoples in the Caucasus region used sheepskins placed in rivers to trap gold particles washed down from the Caucasus Mountains. The fleece would collect gold dust and flakes. When removed and dried, it would glitter. A golden fleece. The greatest treasure in Greek mythology was an ancient Georgian gold mining technique. Jason and the Argonauts sailed to Georgia to steal a method of collecting gold from rivers. The myths of ancient Greece were partially set in Georgia, and the golden object at the center of one of the world's most enduring adventure stories was Georgian technology. Fact 9. Prometheus was chained to a Georgian mountain. In Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. As punishment, Zeus chained him to a mountain in the Caucasus, where an eagle would devour his liver each day, only for it to regenerate overnight so the torture could begin again. Ancient Greek writers placed this mountain in the Caucasus Range. The specific peak most associated with this myth is Mount Kazbegi in Georgia, a 5,034-meter summit that towers above the surrounding landscape like a natural throne. The story of how humanity got fire, one of the oldest and most significant myths in Western civilization, is set in Georgia. The mountain where the gods punished the being who gave humans the most transformative technology in history is a Georgian mountain, and you can hike to it. There is a trail. There is a famous medieval church, Trinity Church, perched near its base at 2,170 meters elevation. It appears in every Georgia travel photograph. Millions of people have photographed that church. Almost none of them know they are looking at the mountain where Prometheus was supposed to be chained. Fact 10. Georgia's alphabet is one of only 14 original alphabets ever invented. Most alphabets in the world are descended from other alphabets. The Latin alphabet, which you are reading right now, descended from the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet descended from Phoenician. The Arabic alphabet descended from Aramaic. Almost every writing system on Earth traces its origins to a handful of ancient sources. Georgia's alphabet is different. The Georgian script is one of only 14 writing systems in human history that were invented independently, not adapted or borrowed from another culture, but created from scratch. It dates back to the 5th century AD and has remained largely unchanged for 1,500 years. The letters are entirely unique. They look like nothing else in the world. Round, elegant, ancient, and completely incomprehensible to anyone who hasn't specifically learned them. There are 33 letters. Each one has existed in roughly the same form since the time of the Roman Empire. Georgia is one of the very few places on Earth where you can see writing that was invented independently by a culture working entirely on its own. The script itself is a ghost, a window into a civilization that developed parallel to the ancient world without copying anyone else's answers. Fact 11. Stalin was Georgian, and Georgia has complicated feelings about it. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until his death in 1953, who oversaw the deaths of millions, who shaped the 20th century more than almost any other individual, was born in a small Georgian town called Gori in 1878. He was not Russian, he was Georgian. He spoke Georgian as his first language. He had a heavy Georgian accent in Russian for his entire life. And in Gori today, there is still a museum dedicated to his life. This is the genuinely uncomfortable fact. The Stalin Museum in Gori was not a Soviet-era relic left standing through neglect. It has been actively maintained and visited as a point of local interest. His childhood home is preserved under a protective canopy. His personal railway carriage is on display. Visitors can sit at a replica of his desk. Georgia has a complex relationship with its most famous son. The man who gave the world one of the most brutal regimes in modern history is also, in Gori, a source of something approaching local pride. It is one of the most uncomfortable and most honest pieces of history in any country on Earth, and almost no geography video has ever touched it directly. Fact 12. Europe's highest permanently inhabited village is not in Switzerland. It's in Georgia. The village of Ushguli in Georgia's Svaneti region sits at 2,200 meters above sea level. It is the highest continuously inhabited settlement in Europe, not a Swiss mountain village, not an Austrian alpine community, a Georgian village that has been permanently occupied for centuries, through brutal winters, through Mongol raids, through Soviet collectivization, through the collapse of the Soviet Union. without ever being abandoned. Ushkuli is famous for its medieval defensive towers, tall stone structures built by Svan families to protect themselves from raiding neighbors. Each family had their own tower. In some cases, towers were built to protect families from each other. The result is a village that looks like someone scattered dozens of ancient stone towers across a high mountain plain, surrounded by peaks that exceed 5,000 meters, at an altitude where most European settlements would have been abandoned centuries ago. Europe's highest village is in one of Europe's least visited countries, and almost nobody knows it exists. Fact 13. Georgia exists between Europe and Asia, and neither continent fully accepts it. Here is the geographic identity crisis at the heart of Georgia. Is Georgia in Europe or Asia? The honest answer is, nobody agrees. The United Nations Statistics Division classifies Georgia as part of Western Asia, but Georgia participates in Eurovision, the European Song Contest. Georgia participates in the European Football Championship. Georgia has applied for European Union membership and received candidate status in 2023. The country sits on the border of two continental definitions that have never been consistently applied. The Caucasus Mountains, which form Georgia's northern border, are sometimes defined as the boundary between Europe and Asia. Under that definition, Georgia is in Asia. But if you define the boundary along the watershed of the Greater Caucasus, which places the mountain crest as the border, then Georgia falls into Europe. Georgia has been fighting for EU membership. Its people protested in the streets for it in 2023 in some of the largest demonstrations in the country's post-Soviet history. And yet the United Nations officially categorizes it as a West Asian country. Georgia is a country that wants to be European, is categorized as Asian, sits on a border that doesn't officially exist, and has two regions inside it that the map says are Georgian, but the military situation says are not. On every level, geographically, politically, culturally, Georgia doesn't fit neatly into any category anyone has built for it. Fact 14. Georgia was a democracy before most of Europe even knew what one was. In the 12th and 13th centuries, under King David the Builder, and then Queen Tamar, Georgia reached what historians call its golden age. At a time when most of Europe was ruled by absolute monarchs with unchecked power, Georgia had a functioning royal council that placed formal limits on royal authority. Queen Tamar, who ruled from 1184 to 1213, was the first female ruler in Georgian history to hold the title of king rather than queen, a deliberate political statement about the equality of her authority. She expanded Georgia's territory to its greatest historical extent. She patronized the arts. She commissioned the construction of hundreds of churches and monasteries. The poet Shota Rustaveli wrote The Knight in the Panther's Skin, considered the masterpiece of Georgian literature, in dedication to her. Georgia at its peak was one of the most sophisticated political and cultural entities in the medieval world. While the Crusades were being fought in the Middle East and plague was beginning its crawl across Europe, Georgia was building underground cities, writing epic poetry, and operating a political system that placed limits on royal power. A medieval democracy in the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian that almost nobody knows existed. Fact 15. Georgia doesn't make sense, and that's exactly the point. Here's the honest conclusion this video has been building toward. Georgia should not exist, not in the way it currently does, not with the history it carries, not with the geography it occupies. A country this small, roughly the size of the US state of West Virginia, has no business containing the oldest human remains outside Africa, the deepest cave on Earth, the birthplace of wine, the location of the world's most famous myths, music that has left the solar system, a medieval underground city, and a border dispute that Russia and the West have been quietly arguing about for 30 years. It should be famous. It should be on every geography curriculum. It should be in every travel documentary. Instead, most people, if they think of Georgia at all, think of a US state. Georgia, the country, has spent its entire modern history being overlooked. Fought over by Persia, Turkey, and Russia for centuries, absorbed into the Soviet Union for 70 years, and then, after independence in 1991, immediately losing two of its own regions to a conflict that the world paid attention to for exactly 1 week in August 2008. The reason Georgia doesn't make sense is not because of its geography. Its geography makes perfect sense. Ancient, extreme, layered, and absolutely extraordinary. The reason Georgia doesn't make sense is because the world built a story about which countries matter. And somehow, despite everything, Georgia didn't make the cut. That's the most controversial thing about this country. Not the breakaway regions, not the wine debate, not the mountains being taller than the Alps. The most controversial thing about Georgia is that it's this extraordinary and still this invisible. If this changed how you see Georgia, subscribe. because next time we're going to a place that has been hiding in plain sight for even longer.